highly regarded for her expertise in professionalism and widely recognized as an innovative leader in the field of disruptive behavior. She's, I think everybody knows, the author of this very informative and popular book entitled The Schmuck in My Office: How to Deal Effectively with Difficult People at Work. It's actually a terrific book. I don't know that you're selling them here, but it is a terrific book. And I know, therefore, that you're in for a very engaging and enlightening lecture. Dr. Foster.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned to Warren, this book was supposed to be my ticket to becoming an emeritus professor, but it didn't quite happen that way. So I was asked, the call to give this talk came with a request to talk about the book. So I'm going to speak less about the data related to disruptive physician behavior and things like that, and just more about the associated content. Conflict can be anywhere and everywhere, and it's omnipresent. And whenever you put two people together, you simply have the capacity for conflict. It's like putting two atoms in a jar. They're going to hit. And when you marry, oh, hi, Julie. When you marry your spouse, you don't expect that you're going to have conflict. Everything is perfect. But of course you do, because it's perfectly normal. It's the management of conflict and it's the manifestation of conflict that causes us trouble. Some conflict is very obvious. When somebody throws a scalpel across the operating room, that's very obvious that's disruptive behavior. But sometimes it's so insidious and so passive-aggressive that you literally don't know it's happened until days or even weeks later. I'm supposedly an expert in this field, and in the past couple of years, I had an interaction with one of my myriad number of bosses, and it was literally in my sleep many days later that I said, oh my God, she was a jerk to me, and it took a while. So some people are very, very adept. And now that there are so many different ways to communicate, email, text, whatever, the insidious disruptive person has even more vehicles to be passive aggressive. And there are people who really have a talent for being able to, for example, write an email which to an objective viewer looks perfectly fine, but when you receive it, you know it's an absolute dagger. And so if I had to say, that's probably the most corrosive virus in terms of disruptive behavior are the people who are not overt with it. When you're having a conflict with somebody, it's important to know or notice whether this is something unusual for that person or whether this is a pattern of their behavior. And it's also important to notice that the behavior itself is almost identical to the same behavior that our children are bringing us, our little itty-bitty children. The behavior itself is truly identical, but the intervention with a toddler who's about to walk into traffic and with a 6'5" anesthesiologist who's screaming at you are two very, very different things. All that said, behavior just affects each one of us differently. We bring our own material to the table, and when somebody is interacting with us in a way that feels disruptive to us, we have to really do an inventory about why it's affecting us this way, because I might be standing right next to you, and the two of us might witness the same exact interaction, and one of us may be absolutely horrified by it, and the other person might just shrug their shoulders and walk away. We, fortunately for me, want to understand why people act the way they do. It's a topic that interests all of us all the time. And particularly for those of us in the hiring position, we want to be able to predict people's behavior if we can. And the good news is that if you look closely and if you simply listen to what people have to say, you'll learn a lot about them almost immediately. People are really, in many ways, very open. And if you simply receive the clues and the information that's being delivered to you and you take it under advisement and you piece together some thoughts about who that person is or how they navigate the world, you can do a certain amount of prediction. And as I move through this talk, I want to be clear that, number one, I don't think anybody, not anybody, but I think that 99.5% of the people that we're working with, even those who are disruptive, are not ill. They're not mentally ill. They're not sick. They just have personalities, and we all have personalities, and we bring those personalities to work with us. But we often, when we have an uncomfortable interaction, we just want it to stop. We want it to go away. We want to think it was a one-timer. When somebody acts badly, and particularly if we're in a management situation, we very often don't want to confront it. It's very uncomfortable, and we just hope they're going to stop doing that thing. But they're not likely to stop doing that thing unless there's something going on, particularly in their lives, that's making them act in this way right now, but they otherwise don't do it. So what happens is that people wait and let the behavior occur again and again and again, because again, in general, we tend to behave the same ways over and over again because it's who we are. And by the time we have to intervene as managers, we're so angry and so annoyed that the person didn't just stop doing this thing that we label them. We label them jerks and assholes and schmucks and whatever it is. So I labeled the book The Schmuck in My Office because probably 85% of the calls that come to me go something like, Jody, I should have called you 10 years ago. I have this schmuck in my department. I have this jerk in my office. And they're not jerks or schmucks at all. Again, they're being themselves. And we just didn't intervene. And again, we avoid direct approaches to uncomfortable topics. For those of you who've heard me speak before, I will repeat several of my jokes, so please bear with me or just finish your lunch and go. But when I finished the book, the editor said, "Great job, you know, loved reading it, but you know what, Jody, I couldn't find my schmuck." And I said, "Oh, well, okay, well, who's your schmuck?" And he proceeded to describe the situation. This is a publisher in the Flatiron Building in New York, so it's an old building and a small company, St. Martin's Press. And, you know, small company, old building, single bathroom stall in this one area. You'd be amazed how much disruptive behavior, particularly in corporate sector, centers around the bathroom and the shared refrigerator. It's kind of remarkable. But so this particular individual would repeatedly, and again, it's small. I can't stress how small this company was, but this unknown individual would go to this single bathroom in this small place and routinely clog the toilet. But not only did he or she clog the toilet, he would then take reams of toilet paper and just shove it in the toilet until it was utterly unusable. And then to make matters worse, they would take toilet paper and literally mummify the toilet bowl. So this was a completely unusable thing for the rest of the day. And so obviously my first response to this guy is, no, I didn't put that individual in my book. At the same time, he wasn't noticing other parts of what was happening here. It was a pretty obsessive ritual that was going on here. But you know, nobody was stopping to think about who that might be. They also weren't doing anything to determine who the person was. But what they were doing was spending an inordinate amount of time at the water cooler talking about the mummified toilets and talking about who can it be and why are they doing it and how can they do it? Did it happen today? It just happened this week. Is it going to happen again? Blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, spending all that time trying to find usable toilets. So he said, what do I do? And I was like, what do? You put up a sign that says stop. You know, just don't do it. No, I can't do that. That's too direct. No, I could never do that. Months pass, more of the same. The lost productivity is remarkable. And then finally he calls, he goes, we finally did it. We finally HR put up a sign. It said cease and desist. You know, we're going to suss you out. It's going to be humiliating. You can't do this. And I said, so what happened? He goes, well, it stopped. Like months and months and months of lost productivity over a conversation that they don't want to have. And I'm not suggesting that the behavior didn't move to the McDonald's across the street. I'm sure it did. But it moved out of the office because a limit was set within the office. So one disruptive character can truly infect an entire team and even the entire workplace. And a really important there are two, in the world of data, there are two really, really important points of data to take home. The first and the most important is that there is an increasing body of literature on this stuff. And consistently it shows that around 80% of people, when confronted with behavior that is considered disruptive, stop. They just stop because they didn't particularly know that their behavior was causing distress. Because again, think about it. We grow up, we develop our coping mechanisms, we navigate the world in the way that we navigate the world, and it works for us. And it works for us in all sorts of settings. It works at home, it works at school, it works in these jobs that we've been in, and then boom, we come into this job or into this culture, and all of a sudden this thing we've always been doing stops working and nobody tells us. They just talk around it. And the data shows that if you give people the courtesy, if you have the bravery and give people the courtesy of just saying, you know, this thing that you're doing doesn't work here and it's causing trouble here, most people will be horrified or shocked and stop. So it's incredibly important to lay out the rules of engagement, define a culture. The worst thing you can do when you're interviewing someone for a job, for example, is to try to put, you know, a foot forward that indicates that the place is different from what the place actually is, because you don't want to draw people in under false pretenses, and people want to, you know, have the best chance of matching themselves to a culture where they're going to do best. The other thing is to remember that most disruptive behavior is absolutely not driven by malice. People don't come to work in the morning and say, I'm going to be disruptive at work today, or it just doesn't work like that. So you have to give people the benefit of the doubt, at least when you're first approaching the situation. So I did add this slide because this is a School of Medicine group, and this is just a collection of behaviors that people consider unprofessional at work. When the Joint Commission first put out the dictum that disruptive physician behavior was a patient safety and quality issue and that various hospitals and health systems needed to intervene with them, you know, literature came out as well, what is considered disruptive behavior? And as you see, there's a long list. Some of it, well, all of it has a spectrum of behavior. I always like to note that if there were not a spectrum of behavior related to bullet one, I would have been fired about 25 years ago. But I have anecdotes, as you might imagine, for every one of these. And there are many, many different ways to be disruptive. But again, there's little ways that are probably okay and unnoticed, and then there are more significant ways. One of my favorites, the second to last bullet, the inappropriate comments in the medical record. When EPIC was first rolled out at Penn, there was just an uproar. I mean, people were just so frustrated and upset with the medical record. And this one person, who I guess didn't have an outlet for his frustration, would write charts that, for example, said, 69-year-old male presents with acute chest pain, fuck EPIC, and had these things all over the medical record. And, you know, was embarrassed, but, you know, was so frustrated, couldn't fathom another way to express his thoughts. Here's the second piece of really important data. The cost of a bad hire is 15 to 20 times the base salary. This is out of GH Smart, the management consulting firm. This is a really conservative estimate. Their data actually showed it was more like 30 times, but they put 15 to 20 just to be beyond reproach in terms of their data collection. And if that bad hire is allowed to hire his or her own team, the cost rises exponentially. So again, 80% of people stop their bad behavior if you simply tell them to stop. And the cost of a bad hire is 15 to 20 times the base salary. These are very, very significant pieces of data and lead to the emotional and financial cost of these hires. So, you know, just as when you go to a dermatologist with a little mole and you fear that all of this is growing underneath, this is how it is with people. I mentioned before that people tend to be open and kind of hand themselves over, but they obviously don't give you the full story, but they give you the tip of the iceberg. And if you just pay attention to the tip of the iceberg and think about the themes associated with the tips of the iceberg, I'm not in any way suggesting that you diagnose people. You can't diagnose people. You know, from a psychiatric standpoint, it's simply not, it doesn't happen that way. But you know, just as when you might buy a newspaper from the newspaper person and that person smiles at you, you register, oh, that's a nice person. I'm just suggesting that there are certain pieces of data that people give you that you can help you bucket them. And if you bucket them in a consistent and thoughtful way, you'll learn a lot. So I've been doing this work specifically with disruptive people here for the past 10 or so years, out in the corporate world and lots of the museum world, the education world, and and prior to that, in my life as an inpatient psychiatrist, I've seen many a disruptive person, and as the tens of stories become hundreds, become thousands, you learn to have themes, and what I've determined is that there are basically 10 major buckets of people who get into trouble with other people. I'm not suggesting that there's only 10 types of people, because there aren't. But there are 10 types of people who get into trouble with other people, and perhaps this is a more evocative slide. And I'm going to leave this slide up a while, because as you look at each picture, I'm sure you're going to think about people. You should also remember that this, when I wrote a book called The Schmuck in My Office, I could have just as easily called it The Schmuck in My Bedroom or The Schmuck in My Church or whatever it is, because it really doesn't matter where you find these conflicts. They are the same. So I'm not suggesting that people fall neatly into any one bucket. That's very rare. What I am suggesting is that that these are the buckets of people who have interpersonal conflict, and often somebody will bring 2 or 3 of them to the table. So the first 3 are what I would call the seductive cluster of people. And I've renamed these again to just drive home the point that I do not think that any of these people are mentally ill. These are people who have personality traits. We all have personality traits. If we didn't, we would be Stepford wives. And these traits can be grouped. So Narcissus is the potentially charismatic, confident person who you might want to, follow into business, or who has a big idea or something like that. But unfortunately, with time, you might find that they're not really able to come through with what they promised that they would deliver. This is someone who has a sort of boundless sense of what he or she is able to do, and a boundless desire to achieve and achieve and achieve. This is someone who demands praise and vanity, and really doesn't hear anything that's not a positive, or if they do hear something that is a negative, it's truly wounding and jarring to them. The basic dynamic in someone with narcissistic traits is that there's a significant dichotomy between the elevated or expanded self-esteem and, in fact, a very significant core of low self-esteem. And so they're constantly balancing this dichotomy. And if you think of, I like to think about if someone's real ego size is like the size of a peanut, and they take that peanut and they drop it in a balloon, and then they blow up the balloon as big as they can, fill the room with the balloon. And that's the ego they present to the world. Well, that's the person you meet. And so these people, they'll talk over you. They'll fill the room with themselves. They'll redirect the conversation to themselves. They'll want all the attention. They'll take credit for your work. They'll do all of this. But, if you think about a balloon, what could be more fragile? If you pop a balloon, it's right-sized instantly. And it's the same with the narcissist. The wounding of the narcissistic ego can be so damaging, it can even be dangerous. So you've heard stories about CEOs of startup companies who, when their company goes public, it's a grand failure and they have a major depression, or sometimes they even kill themselves. Or the small town valedictorian in high school who goes to the big college and is only getting average grades or perhaps failing. These are narcissistic injuries that are very, very profound. And Narcissus can either be this expansive type, the one who fills the room with himself, or it can also be a wounded presentation where the person is always talking about what they're not being given or what they're not getting, or I have so many publications, but I didn't get the corner office, and blah, 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 blah. And why did this person get the promotion and I didn't? And even though it's all sort of sounds self-deprecatory and negative, if you listen to the contents, it's just as egocentric. And it's the same exact pathology, just in a different form, which is true of many of these, that there's an expansive and a sort of more withdrawn or negative presentation. And then there's what we call in psychiatry the malignant narcissist, or what I would just call the impossible narcissist, where there's truly no capacity for insight. And this is someone who is just stuck in their entitlement. So what do? One of the important things to do that many people find nothing short of nauseating is to compliment these people, to make them feel better. And I'm not suggesting that you should go out of your way to just blow, smoke. But if you have the opportunity to notice something or say something positive to such a person, that's going to immediately clarify for that person that you're not out to pop the balloon. And in fact, you don't need to, they don't need to work quite as hard to keep that balloon full around you, because you're not out to, get to the peanut in the middle. Another thing is, if you can appeal to their narcissism by, this is something that I do all the time with people who are referred to me. I'll have somebody with narcissistic pathology who's, done something or has a pattern of doing something. And the first half of our time together will be spent talking about, how they didn't really do that thing. It was everyone else's fault, or whatever it is. And no penetration whatsoever that there might be any responsibility. And then I might say something like, you really have such tremendous leadership potential. You could probably be a dean or a chair one day. And then suddenly there's silence, and the person goes, I think that too. And I say, it's just this one thing you do. When you punch people in the face at work, it's just this one thing you do that gets in the way of your being able to achieve your full potential. And as soon as I say that, they're basically sitting on the couch with me. They're like writing with me. You're right. My wife says this too. What do we need to do? And then you have them, have a ready audience who really wants to work with you to do better, because the whole scenario has been changed. You obviously need to make sure that you don't get in a situation where this person can take credit for your work. You want to reward the team over the individual. There's a number of strategies that you can use to mitigate the narcissist's impact on the workplace. There's something called the sandwich technique, which is very popular, where you compliment and then you sort of shove in the negative thing you have to say, and then you end with a compliment, all in a sort of ego-preserving strategy. While that might make sense, almost everyone is terrible at it. And so you got these very generous, thick slices of white bread, and then like a single piece of bologna in the middle. It just doesn't work. So being direct and concise is generally much better. Anyway, a lot of time I spend on narcissists, because the fact of the matter is that's probably a good 80% of the stuff that's sent to me, certainly in our field. The Venus flytrap is in its most pathological form, when somebody really sick with this pathology would have what we would call borderline personality. And this is somebody who initially is very, very seductive and appealing. This is, and that's Glenn Close from Fatal Attraction, for those of you who don't recognize. And so this is somebody who draws you in and often puts you on a pedestal, makes you feel so good, and makes you feel so interesting and just so exciting to be with. And you love it, and you find that you really look forward to interactions with this person more than you're really used to. And you often also find that you might even stretch your boundaries just a little bit more for this person than you otherwise would. And what you don't see manifestly is that there's an almost prescribed flip that occurs. There's a cycle, and the cycle is overvaluation and devaluation. And so just as wonderful as the beginning was, that is how chaotic and difficult and oftentimes repugnant the negative can be. And why is this happening? Well, this person doesn't really have a sense of themselves or their identity or their ego, and they kind of oftentimes don't know where they end and you begin. And they not unlike a succubus, sometimes are wanting you so that they can sort of survive on your identity and things like that. But again, there's an anxiety. These are intense interpersonal relationships, but there's this anxiety that there's going to be abandonment. You can't love me, you're going to leave me. And if you've ever been really anxious about something, like so anxious that you just need to get it over with, similarly, the Venus flytrap might make her or himself so unappealing as to push the envelope to that point where you do leave them, because the anxiety that you're going to leave them versus all the testing to see if you will, and the eventuality that you did, is actually less anxiety producing than the worry that it's going to happen. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you've met such a person, I know it makes perfect sense. What I can tell you is that when this particular character flips into the negative, it can cause an unparalleled amount of chaos and drama in the workplace. And the key, this particular type of person is the bane of the psychiatry resident's existence. It takes an entire training to start to figure out how to handle. At the end of the day, though, it's really quite easy, which is that because there's not this sense of self, you really have to build a scaffold around this person. You have to build, a fence of limits so that, they can test and test and test, but the wall is here. This is where my behavior has to stop. And there'll be resistance, and who are you to set limits with me, and whatever it is, but at the end of the day, it will de-escalate the anxiety, and it'll allow for a playing field, a sandbox of behaviors that this person knows are okay and that they'll do well in. And the more consistent and the more boundaried you can be with such a person, the better likelihood you have of having a positive relationship with them. Does this make sense? Any questions from anybody? I don't mind being derailed if you want to ask questions. Okay. That's of. Yeah, I mean, setting a boundary can be an incredibly little thing. Like, again, this is another character where there's this sort of activated and angry, I'm walking on eggshells around this person versus the one who's just sort of more of a Debbie Downer type. And so it may be that you're, I don't know, in a cubicle next to someone who's constantly talking about their abusive boyfriend or whatever it is, and on and on and on and on and on, and you find yourself getting drawn in, and maybe sometimes they're, hopeless or even suicidal or whatever it is. But, as this person's constant talking about their situation is getting in the way of your work, you could say, I really do want to hear about this. I'm interested in it, but I do have this project I need to get done. How about if we meet at 2 o'clock for coffee and talk about it? So that's like, it's a limit, even though it's not a mean limit or anything like that. By the same token, a lot of times, let's say a student or a junior faculty member who's being seductive with the more senior person. And the vulnerable senior person who gets involved in such a situation can, really bad things can happen. But if you're going to be boundaried and appropriate, when you see that somebody is, looking for extra or whatever, instead of getting involved in it and getting involved in the drama, to say, you know what, I think you should come, weekly at this time or even assign that to another person who doesn't have the intensity. Just, many different ways to set a limit without it feeling brutal. The third character that's Bernie Madoff. So many of us may recall that right in our sister organization down the street, there was a general counsel, a very, very appealing, seductive man that everybody loved working for. Everyone liked him, great guy. And a few years into his tenure, it was determined that he was actually embezzling millions of dollars from the organization. So swindlers are people who, and there's a tremendous range in these people, and it can go from little itty bitty things like jaywalking all the way to serial killing. I mean, this is swindling can take many forms, but the thing about the swindler is you're drawn in. Their talent is to read you and to read what they can get from you. And you get drawn in by them. Again, they're seductive people. You want to follow them. They are affable. They might have big ideas or run a tight ship, whatever it is. And people feel so completely duped when they learn of what has been going on. That's the disruptive event is the discovery. And it can have very dramatic conclusions, like this particular general counsel was walked off the job to prison. But I mean, this comes up in our daily lives with our contractors for our homes, right? You hire someone and they're very, very seductive, and everything's going to be great, and you give them money and trust, and then all of a sudden they start to miss, and there's one excuse and two excuses, and it can really kind of get in your way. So, best thing to do with a swindler is to suss them out early and to not have them around you. If you find that somebody is doing something criminal or close to it, then you should make the assumption that there's more there and do what you can to separate. Because again, if you're working for a swindler, there's nothing to say that when it hits the fan, you're not going to be implicated in some of it. So it's also a self-protective thing. So those are the three seductive ones. And these are the most common. And again, these are the ones that you're drawn in, and the underbellies of their personalities are what really cause the trouble. And they come with this feeling of betrayal and shock because it's so different from what you were originally drawn into. The next character stands alone for me as the annoying cluster. This is the obsessive, the bean counter, the micromanager, the person who pseudo-delegates and yet knows inside that they're really the only one who can do the job right. And so they let you do something, but they'll return a document to you, let's say, with 200 red marks. And then when you send it back corrected, they'll send it with 200 more, oftentimes retracting the first set of red marks that they gave you. And their basic dynamic is that they are terrified of losing control. And obviously, you can't control the vicissitudes of life. Life happens, so you control what you can control. And sometimes what you can control is you, the person working with them. And so when I was writing the book, this was actually the hardest chapter for me because I was flooded with so many examples of people who have tortured and micromanaged me over the years that it took the longest amount of time. Ideally, you can be in a position to direct this person to detail-oriented activities. The problem is that because these are detailed people and they do things carefully and usually correctly, they oftentimes get over-promoted. And so before you know it, this micromanager is in an operations position. And one major problem is that they, instead of viewing the whole city, they're only taking care of Sansom Street. And the whole, the rest of the operation falls by the wayside. So operationally, it tends to be a problem, but also this focus on detail is really not consistent with good management. And these are often not good matches as leaders. The next three are what I would call the sort of cognitive cluster. The distracted is, yes. Yeah, if you have, well, thank you for reminding me to say that. So let's take that document that you got with 200 red marks. So the first thing to do is make the corrections, but catalog the corrections. So you told me to do this, I did this, because literally it will ricochet back and forth between you ad nauseum. The other thing is that if you make a mistake, own the mistake. The worst thing you could do is try to talk around the mistake because then they're going to trust you even less. And let them know that you admire their attention to detail, but that you also are attentive to detail and that you can also be relied upon and behave in a way that supports that so that perhaps over time they will come to trust you and not have to control you quite as tightly. So the distracted is the nutty professor type. And this is not somebody who necessarily gets into so much overt interpersonal trouble, but people get really angry at them because they want things from them and they can't close the deal. They can't finish the project. Their desk looks like a tornado hit it. You might be dealing with the lawyers in the Office of General Counsel, and they've had this policy for 18 months, and why can't they turn it around? And these are just people, they're obviously not bad people, and they generally feel terrible about this part of their personality, but they're just not good at time management. They don't know how to prioritize. They don't have a realistic sense of how much time things are going to take, and they just really have trouble finishing things. Such a person often will kind of take some time off and get everything organized and try to have a new start, have a clean desk, and then they'll feel really good about it and promise that they're going to do better moving forward, and they do for a little while, but then before you know it, the desk looks like that again. So as someone in a leadership position, and this comes up a lot with people here, not being able to close their charts and they're losing the billing because they couldn't get the work done. And encouraging people to divide their work into bite-sized pieces, giving them a work environment with as few distractions as possible, assigning them things after they've completed the one thing. You unfortunately will have to be in a position of having to help structure them. And then, of course, giving them time management tools helps. But again, if something's within your character, it's going to be very hard to stop doing it. But those things can be helpful for the motivated person. The next two characters of the 10 are the only ones who could actually have something wrong with them. So Mr. Hyde is somebody who might be dealing with a substance issue. So you've hired Dr. Jekyll, and lo and behold, you have Mr. Hyde when you come to work. And there have been some upsetting and fantastic stories about this. I myself, many years ago, worked with an anesthesiologist who was, I think he was the head of his division somewhere, and not the nicest guy, considered arrogant, but very competent and had been in a leadership position for a long time. And I mean, people noted that he got irritable a lot, but that was about it. And then in one of these shocking events, he was found one day in a dark operating room walking in circles with a syringe hanging from his arm. The thing about substance use is there's no quick and easy way to find it. In psychiatry, for example, every psychiatric diagnosis has the caveat that says blah, 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 and not the result of substance use, because substances can mirror and mimic any psychiatric disorder. So what you really have to look for to suspect it is just an erratic baseline of behavior. So, and again, that erratic could be that this is their baseline, and then they're really kind of up and agitated or angry, or then they seem down or depressed, or then there's a period of normalcy. And so whereas the other people will have patterns, Mr. Hyde will generally not have as many patterns, and that should have you thinking about it. But it's extremely hard to suss out. And of course, when it happens, the thing to do is to simply, help them get to help if they want it. The lost is someone who's struggling with some cognitive issue, and this might be, a reversible situation, like somebody who started a medication for something and is having some cognitive side effects that they're not aware of. And sometimes it could also be someone who's having real cognitive decline associated with a dementing process. And we've had some very, very sad situations around that over the years. One in particular at my mental health center, a woman who was the go-to person, understood everything, knew where everything was, the fix-it person, and everybody relied on her. And then all of a sudden she started to make some mistakes. And again, she was not necessarily being disruptive interpersonally, but she was making mistakes, and people were getting angry at her because she was always, the one to do it right, and she was doing it wrong, and everybody was getting angry and irritable and blaming. And then when it came out that, in fact, she had a frontal dementia, and that her mother had a frontal dementia, and that she was really having significant cognitive decline, well, then, of course, everybody brought understanding and empathy to the picture. But in that period of time where there was conflict, it was really quite difficult. Also, as sometimes people are aware that they're having some cognitive loss, there's a lot of defensiveness and some confabulation, the development of stories and ideas to socialize over those deficits. And that's where you might have some more conflict. People might blame someone else for their mistakes to try to cover up their mistakes. This comes up a lot in medicine, unfortunately, as we get older, and many of us who haven't necessarily developed other hobbies or other things to do, and the idea of retiring is just really a difficult or unacceptable idea. And sometimes we have people who, let's say somebody who wrote the book in whatever their field is, and the current chair or chief is the disciple of that person. And so there's all this respect, but the person is really not functioning as well. And so first there's the getting over the hump of intervening with that person in the first place. But then what do you do if they don't want to stop working? And so sometimes they get sent for an independent medical eval, and sometimes they're even sent for neuropsychological testing. And even that's a problem, because what happens is these brilliant, brilliant people are psych tested, IQ tested, and they score fine. But it's an average score. And when they were at their height, their scores were off the charts. But you can't do anything with that information because it's still an okay score. So these can present some really difficult situations. And the last three are what I would simply call the weird cluster. The robotic person is someone who has what we might colloquially call lives on the spectrum. This is someone who just simply lacks interpersonal nuance. And such a person is often rigid in his or her routines, tends to be focused on an area of their interest, and that's most of what they talk about and what they want to talk about, and they tend to lecture. But also, if things go wrong, they tend to get very frustrated and sometimes even tantrum. I saw a physician once who something happened with a patient that was not in the order or the protocol that he wanted and expected, and he went, he stood in the middle of a nursing station just throwing charts and throwing staplers and just screaming vitriolic expletives and just really terrified everyone around him. And the reaction of the people around him was just hatred. They didn't understand him. They didn't know why he was acting that way. They would try to be friendly with him, but they would get nothing back. And it's because he didn't know how to. And literally the intervention for this person is social skills training, literally like interpersonal ecetiquette. Like when I say, good morning, how are you? You say, fine, thank you, how are you? This does not come naturally to such a person. The eccentric is someone who literally is just plain strange, but they have magical ideas or beliefs about things. They, again, don't tend to be disruptive per se, but they tend to raise eyebrows. So my favorite story about this is a surgeon I came across who was a perfectly functional surgeon, no problems with his work whatsoever. But when he would finish his surgeries, kind of to end the event, he would put a happy little sticker near the incision site. It was very strange. It's not bad. It's not, but imagine if you've just had your total hip and you come home, and you're finally with trepidation ready to take off your bandage and take a look at the incision, and there's Hello Kitty staring up at you. It's very strange. And so finally, he was confronted with this, and indeed, he truly believed that something about the sticker just finished the surgery. And he further believed that it in some way aided or was sort of a good luck charm for healing. So again, I'm not talking about people who are just, weird. A lot of us are weird. This is someone who has a belief system attached to that. And then the last character is my personal favorite, having lived a career on inpatient psychiatry with paranoid schizophrenics. This is the suspicious character, and this is someone who just has a conspiratorial or paranoid outlook on the world. And everything you say gets woven into this conspiratorial system that the person has developed. So it feels very easy to misstep, very easy to offend, and sometimes these are the people who can actually get dangerous if they've really felt wronged or they've gotten, laid off in a certain situation and blame a particular person or somebody looked at them a certain way or whatever it is. And again, these are sometimes the stories of the people who come back to the office after being let go and are violent. They can be potentially scary. And the best way to handle such a person is through a strategy that I think stands for all of these characters, which is to interact concisely and directly. Say what you have to say in a clear and linear form, because for many of these characters, if you're trying to intervene with them and you use too many words, you're giving them too much fodder to work with. So I actually have learned a bit about talking about all the characters when the pictures are up. But in terms of things that are true for everybody and that can be used across all characters, you have to take some certain take-home points with you. Again, accept that people don't set out to be disruptive. They don't. People are being themselves. And when people are stressed, they're oftentimes a less pleasant or less appealing version of themselves. When we're under stress, we regress, and that happens. And so a character trait that we have that we may even know is not particularly appealing may still come out with greater ease when we're stressed. People can often be categorized by themes, and their common behaviors occur commonly. Again, I'm not suggesting that you go back to work or to the people around you and sit around and diagnose them. That's not helpful. What I think is helpful is that you look at who this person is, how they navigate the world, because when you do that, you'll learn certain things about the anxiety that drives them to behave a certain way, and it will help you in terms of how to strategize with them. It would be very nice if every time we had a conflict with somebody, we confronted them and then they spontaneously combusted and they went away. We never had to deal with it again. But, a question I often get is, well, why do I have to work so hard to work around this person? And you're not working around this person. You're working with this person because, like I said, the person's still going to be there the next day, even after you've had a conflict with them. And you have to figure out how to move forward. What is disruptive in one culture may be perfectly acceptable in another culture. When it was time to send my son to school, I could have sent him to a military school or I could have sent him to a Quaker school. They're both completely legitimate educational settings, but I wanted to choose, I chose Quaker. I wanted to choose a particular culture that I wanted to, encourage in my child. But again, it's fine to do something else. Examine yourself. Why is a particular behavior affecting you in a particular way? Before you set out to confront somebody, make sure that it's not you who is misinterpreting or misunderstanding what's gone on. Adult behaviors are largely similar. Adult behavioral rules are largely similar to rules for children and should be applied the same way. It is intimidating, it's hard when it's your peer, when it's your boss. I get a lot of questions, well, what if it's my boss? And my answer is always, well, your boss is a person too. And again, 80% of people confronted will just stop. As a boss, if somebody came to me and said, Jody, I understand that you didn't want me to do such and such, but when you did it in front of my peers, it was very humiliating for me, and please don't do that again. Of course I will accept that, and I won't do it again, and I'll be horrified I did it. So don't just assume that because you're in a position of a subordinate position that you can't intervene with people. Ideally, call out what you see when you see or feel it. The professionalism committee here at Penn has been successful because the interventions are fast. We don't do everything by committee, and we don't have to wait for 15 schedules to get together to be able to intervene with this thing that happened, 8 weeks ago. Something happens, call it out, and do something about it, even if something is just saying, I really didn't like that you did that thing. The longer you let time pass after an event, you are silently condoning that event, and people take it as such. Early intervention is absolutely key. Yes? What? If you haven't done that early intervention. Yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. Look, the whole culture is changing, and so now everybody's having conversations that they should have had X number of years ago. And the first thing that the person who's being intervened with says when they sit down is, I've been doing this for 30 years. Why didn't you tell me this before? And, one answer is, well, in our culture, it didn't used to be such an issue, but it's an issue now, so we have to move forward differently. Or you can say, I was hoping you were going to stop, but I realized that this is kind of how you are. And it's time that I have to tell you that this is causing problems. So, depending upon the particular conversation, there are ways to say, yes, I should have said something before. I didn't, I've even said, it's awkward. I didn't want to talk to you about this, but at this point I have to. There's always a way to say what you have to say. And I personally think that direct honesty is always really the best way to go. And again, be concise, be direct. Pretend all of you are from New York City like I am, and just say what you have to say it out, say it straight, because like I said, the more you talk, number one, you're belying your anxiety about it. But number two, you're confusing people. If what you have to say is, you did this, don't do it, that does not have to be a 2-hour conversation with tears and drama. It just doesn't. And the more you say, the more words you give, that's what this person is going to be ruminating about afterward at night, and you're giving them time and fodder to reinvent the conversation and to get angry about it and to come back at you. Don't do it. In psychiatry, we have a term called ego dystonic. Ego dystonic means this is something that I do, but I really don't like it about myself. Then there's ego syntonic. This is something that I do, and I do like it about myself. if I'm telling you about something that you do and you love it about yourself, there is no way you're going to change it, no matter what I have to say. So if it's not ego dystonic, I mean, it is the rare person who says, yes, ugh, I do, I yell when it's such a horrible quality, help me fix it. I wish everybody said that. Some people do, but so if it's not ego dystonic, the only thing you can do is set limits. The only thing you can do is say, okay, I understand this is you, it's just you, whatever, but you can't do it here. And, let's figure out what behaviors are acceptable and aren't acceptable. But this thing that you do, you can't do it here. As hard as that may be to say, it's gonna be worth it. And finally, if in workplace after workplace or situation after situation, everyone around you is a jerk or an idiot or a schmuck or whatever it is, then it would behoove you at some point in your lifetime to note that there's a common denominator and that the common denominator is you. So if you're lucky enough for somebody to tell you, that this thing you're doing is a problem, or if you're lucky enough to have this epiphany, then, you don't need to fall on your sword. You should take this as an opportunity. I mean, I believe that we all want to do better, and we all don't mean malice. We're all interested in self-betterment. And once you learn this about yourself, well, you have a roadmap on what you need to fix. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? After all that, no questions? All right. Yes.
First of all, comment, I wish I had heard this 20-some years ago.
Well, no one was talking about it 20 years ago.
Because I think that through the years, every one of those types of scenarios leads to the question, you've been doing a great job of doing grand rounds and stuff. Are there some formal educational resources?
So as part of the professionalism campaign, we are going to be developing an associated curriculum. I mean, obviously, for a layman's interpretation, you're welcome to look at the book, but we are going to develop a curriculum with many, many different modes of information delivery for just this. Yeah. Yeah. So this is coming up a lot. Yeah, this is coming up a lot because the culture is changing, and I mean, just the Me Too movement alone, people are walking around straitjacketed because they're afraid to behave in certain ways. The other thing is that certainly for the older among us, what we might have considered stuff that made our days fun is now completely inappropriate. Add that to a current younger culture where there's a real sense of entitlement to call out things that may be perceived as wrong by an individual without any concern for how that call out might affect the person. So, well, on the one hand, you have the student who needs and wants lessons and feedback from a supervisor, and you have a supervisor who wants to give it but feels shackled to do it. And all I can say is that if in all your conversations you are sensitive to the preservation of people's egos, you can say just about any. I used to do oral mock boards for psychiatry, and I was brutally direct. I mean, I said, taken out of context, I said absolutely horrible things to people. But it was the single most popular teaching tool in my entire career. I used to get like 5s on my hamsters because of these mock boards. Because at the end of the day, like I said, people do want to do better. They do want to learn. And they want to know what areas to do better in. And so I think that on both sides, as long as the conversations are clearly meant, it's what we would call a psychologically safe environment. As long as the conversations are meant on both sides to be positive and constructive and not just insulting and not just, a dig, but in fact are preserving and constructive, then, my task in this new professionalism role is to help change the culture so that we know how to do that and that it's safe to do it on both sides. But it is absolutely an issue right now.